Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.
Ellie Harrison is an artist and performance maker whose interactive installation, The Unfair, arrives in her hometown of Leeds on 9th of May, before continuing at the Brighton Festival from the 18th of May. The work is part of her collaboratively created project, The Grief Series, which, while dealing with serious issues to do with death and loss, promises to do so in an open, playful and life-affirming way. Ellie, thanks for talking to British Theatre Guide.
Oh, pleasure.
Can you start by telling us a bit about this Grief Series?
Yeah, well, I suppose the Grief Series sort of started accidentally. I made a show about my experiences of bereavement and loss, and I confessed to a real feeling of anxiety initially, who is going to want to see a female autobiographical solo show about death? But the show's quite playful, and fortunately people did come and see it. And then what started happening was afterwards people would come up to me and they'd say, oh, that really resonated with when I lost my partner, my parents, my child. And I became like a grief magnet. And I suppose I really felt a responsibility to these people that had sometimes told me things they'd never told anyone else before. And I thought, how can I create projects that act as a container to amplify all of these amazing stories and experiences? And so the Grief Series was really born out of that. I mean, I sort of toyed with doing a trilogy at first. A lot of cool kids were doing trilogies. I thought maybe I should do that. But it felt like an arbitrary number, really. So then I found a 7-stage grief model from psychology and thought, 7 projects about death, that is brave and probably quite stupid. And so it seemed like definitely the right thing to pursue.
And when did that all start? So how long have you been working on the
That
series?
was in 2010.
Right.
So I have spent a lot of time talking to people about death. But actually what's been really overwhelming is how generous people have been and how positive and hopeful the work has felt. I don't think it's felt dour or depressing, because actually most of the time, rather than talking about death, we're talking about love. People are telling me about people they care about, and there's a real warmth that I try and bring into all of the work, and humour as well. That feels quite important. Yeah.
So where are we in the stages of grief at the moment? Where does The Unfair fit into that?
Well, so as the work's gone on, it feels more and more a bit like kind of grief tapas, in that all of the work's still in repertoire. So a festival might say, I want part 1, which is a solo show, and then I want part 3, which is a photography exhibition, and then I want part 4, which is The Unfair. So they kind of coexist as a group of projects, rather than a linear structure, which I think is quite nice. It reflects the way that I feel about the grief model, which is that from a therapeutic stance I'm quite sceptical of it. I think it makes grief into a linear process, which I don't think it is. But The Unfair is part 4 of the Grief Series.
And what might an attendee expect when rolling up to The Unfair?
Well, we've been really lucky. I've collaborated with amazing artists, Adam Young, who's a kind of performer, curator and agent of chaos, really. And Bethany Wells, who is a designer and has trained with Carter's Steam Fair, who are professional signwriters. So people that turn up at The Unfair can expect to see beautifully hand-painted Victorian fairground signage. The place smells of popcorn and candy floss, and we give you a nice cup of tea as well. So, yeah, I think the title, The Unfair, felt like the right title. It's kind of playful, and I think humour's been a really important way into talking about what can seem like a difficult subject.
So how much of that is based on your research into grief? How have those elements come together in this piece?
Yeah, well, I'd say The Unfair is probably the least grief-based piece. Part of the grief model is anger, so it does coexist within the kind of grief model as a whole, but it does feel like it has a slightly different identity. And I think anger feels like a really vital thing for us to be talking about right now. Anger that might be related to grief, but might be political anger, might be social anger. So it feels like it's quite open. people fill the unfair with whatever is bothering them or whatever feels urgent, I suppose.
And you were telling me just now there's an element of choice to it.
So when people arrive at the unfair, they get given a ticket and they have to come up with a code name for their anger. So we've had, playful responses like the Hulk, to people saying my ex, or loads of different code names, some subtle and some less subtle. And then you have 4 stamps, so you can pick 4 stalls to take part in, participate in. So you kind of have to choose wisely. So we've got things like the angry karaoke booth with a punchbag in, or the bottle it up bar. So if you want to write a really abusive letter to your boss, your next door neighbour, your ex, you can, and then we'll bottle it up for you so that it will never see the light of day. So we keep them in a kind of a locked space, never to be read.
When you look back on these 4 works, and also forwards, of course, to the remaining kind of stages that you're going to work through, is there kind of a pattern emerging? Has it evolved into something which you can look back and say, I can see this pattern developing?
I definitely think one of the patterns is that I think about what participants smell and taste and hear as well as what they see. So that multisensory approach is definitely a through line, and thinking about audiences being at the centre of the work rather than outside of it looking in. So making immersive spaces, making welcoming spaces. But I also think increasingly one of the through lines is giving people time and attention, which I feel like we're living in a world that increasingly wants us to go faster and faster and fit more and more in. And so actually inviting people to slow down, stop and reflect feels like an increasingly radical act. To go, actually, right now, let's just be in this space, in this place together and have a think about some things.
And you've got more than sort of 140 characters or a short update in order to kind of have those discussions.
Yeah. And I think I always think about what live space can offer us that film or digital space can't. And it is that time to negotiate rather than talking at someone. You're in a dialogue with them.
Yeah. You've worked a lot with theatre designers, a range of artists. Do you see places where this work crosses over with theatre and performance more and less? Is there? Can you talk a bit about the performance elements of your work, performative elements?
Yeah. So I suppose the Grief series started off kind of in a more overtly performative way. So the first part was a solo show where the audience, for the most part, sit at one end. And I suppose it's become more and more about breaking down hierarchies between audience and performer. I don't think I'd go quite as far to say that the audience are the performers, but we are in a conversation, so there's inequality there. It's not, I know what I'm doing, I'm the performer, you sit in the dark and you shut up. It's, okay, we're all here, we're all in this space. I think as well, I suppose the design of it is theatrical. I create spaces that are sort of separate to everyday life, but that allow us as people to imagine a different real life, if that makes sense.
And as you said, there seems to be a real sense of a need at the moment to talk about anger and about grief and about loss. And I was thinking in relation to this about some of the theatre work recently, like Unlimited's Am I Dead Yet? Chris Thorpe and John Spooner. Do you think, what is it could you pinpoint what it is in the air at the moment that makes this conversation so important?
I do think there is beginning to be a shift in the way that people are thinking and talking about death and grief, or a frustration, I suppose. I think sort of back in 1997 when Princess Diana died and people started saying, we're embracing a culture of tears, and I suppose I'm a little bit sceptical of that because those tears feel quite commodified to me. We're used to the reality TV narrative where someone kind of wheels out a sob story, and actually finding spaces for the sincere expression of those feels quite important or valuable. It's interesting that we can talk to our friends and kind of loved ones about sex without feeling we have to be relationship counsellors, but for some reason with death there's still that slight fear, that slight taboo, and that silence. And so I suppose there's a whole wave of artists trying to subtly push back against that and go, actually, we can talk about it, and talking about death doesn't make it happen any sooner.
This is obviously a very culturally bound question. This is within the UK context, possibly even the English context. I don't know. Have you looked at discussions about death in other cultures at all? Is that
yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, for part 7, we're forming an ongoing collaboration. So I'm collaborating with Live Art Bistro in Leeds, but we're forming an ongoing collaboration with artists in Mexico. So we're going out there this autumn to do some research, because I think from what I understand of the Day of the Dead celebrations, it feels totally different. I think UK approaches to grief are characterised by silence. We'll have a minute's silence, or let's have a respectful silence, or whereas a Mexican approach seems to be to embrace it with noise and food and celebration, and I think I'm interested in celebration as a form of resistance. So I'm really looking forward to finding out more. I'm excited.
Yeah, great. And you mentioned, you alluded there to the 7th stage, or the 7th part of this grief series. So where are we now? We're at number 4? So is the unfair number 4?
The unfair's number 4, and that's touring. Then we've got part 5 has also been launched. So that is like a little illustrated box of resources. So that's kind of also touring, but in a much smaller, more intimate way. And then we're just beginning research for part 6, and we're also beginning research for part 7. So it's like a really lovely game of plate spinning to keep all these projects.
Yes. And it's grown increasingly complicated as you've been doing it, presumably.
Yeah. It feels like a really nice, interesting way of juggling. But I think the thing that I'm keen to do is recognise that different people respond to different pieces of work. I wouldn't expect an audience that are a visual art audience to immediately come and see a theatre show, or vice versa. But what's happened is that as the projects begin to have a dialogue with each other, audiences are following from one piece to the next piece to the next piece. And so kind of playfully talk about it as having a team grief, which is made up of artists, audiences, participants, funeral directors, death doulas, clinicians, that are all kind of congregating around this series of work and having conversations that they wouldn't have had otherwise, which for me is kind of beautiful and a bit overwhelming in the best possible way, really.
Yeah. I know that the Unfair itself started off at the Transform Festival here in Leeds.
Yeah.
And various other of your works have had sort of development processes and early kind of sharings. Let's take the Unfair for now. How has that evolved over time?
Yeah, well, it's been an interesting one. The first R&D was called the Rage Receptacle, and took a totally different... We knew that we wanted to make something about anger, or I knew I wanted to make something about anger, but finding the right collaborators, or finding collaborators that can share an ethos, has felt really key to the success of the work. So I like to make work quite slowly, which is deeply unfashionable, but I kind of try and dig my heels in. And spend time, because I'm working right across disciplines, it feels important to spend time thinking about what our shared sense of values are. So, we made the Rage Receptacle as part of Transform, and it felt like we got so far down a path, and then we kind of went, this is great, but actually we need to go back down that path and pursue a different path, a different line of inquiry. And that's when the Unfair was born in the form it is today, in all its beautiful fairgrounded gloss paint steam coming out of the top of the tent glory kind of thing.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And do you travel around with these? Are you always there having those conversations with people, or is it a sense that you've sent them off into the world now to exist?
The unfair to a certain extent, I'm kind of sending out into the world.
Yeah.
I'll be popping my head in. I kind of feel like the unfair is like the rebellious teenager of the grief series. And I'm kind of like, yeah, go off and do your own thing, but I'm just going to keep checking up on you to make sure you're okay.
Yeah.
As the grief series has gone on and there have been more and more projects, I've realised that I either need to clone myself or send things off into the world, but it's in very capable hands. Adam Young, who was one of the core collaborators on this project, is out on the road with it, so you can have a chat with him, and he's a really warm, interesting, funny guy.
Great. And can you tell us a bit about how that collaborative process has worked, presumably differently across the different media and the different projects?
Yeah, so each time it's totally different, and I think what I wanted to do was, Adam is a very different personality to me. I'm very like Julie Andrews and Prim, and Adam, has a totally different perspective, and as does Bethany, the designer. So it's really about looking at our own responses to anger and working out from that. And I was keen to work with Adam because he's got quite a male perspective on anger that I don't have. So it's always about trying to find people to work with that are going to reinvigorate the subject matter, so that I don't get bored, so that audiences don't get bored. So a big part of that was talking about what makes us angry, how we express our anger. I also worked with a group of young people to talk to them about what makes them angry, how they respond to it, what they want to see in the unfair. So it's nice that those young people can finally see it in the, see some of their ideas being realised as well.
And as you're reaching, I won't say completion of the project, but the full creation of those 7 works, well, how do you feel about that? Is there a sense, have you managed to feel cathartic about moving through this grief process?
Well, I think I kind of tend to put quite a strong delineation between things that are therapeutic and therapy. So going for a run might be therapeutic, cooking a meal might be therapeutic. So I think in that sense it has been a therapeutic process, but certainly not therapy. And I'm always keen when I'm working with participants to hold my hands up and go, I'm not a counsellor, I'm just a layman who's really happy to have a chat with you. Yeah, I definitely think when the grief series is over, I will grieve the grief series. Because, I think it's felt bold and maybe a bit stubborn to commit myself to what will be over a decade's body of work. It's a big chunk of my life.
Yeah, sure.
But as I said, it's always being reinvigorated and shifted by whoever I'm collaborating with, whether that's an artist from a different discipline to my discipline, or whether that's by a participant or a professional. So it's constantly evolving, really.
And where's next after the grief project? Do you have any plans after that?
Probably just sleep. Maybe have a takeaway.
Very good. Well, the Unfair is in town in Leeds at Kirkstall Abbey.
Yeah.
From the 9th to the 11th of May, and then it's trundling on to the Brighton Festival from the 18th to the 21st of May. Ellie Harrison, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.